This is a video tutorial for Phil 123, Module 8 on compatibilism. So remember exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about compatibilism. We know that incompatibilism is the thesis that determinism is incompatible with free will. That is, incompatibilists think that if the thesis of determinism is true, if it really is the case that all of our actions are determined by prior events and the laws of nature, then we simply don't have anything like free will, we don't have anything like moral responsibility. Compatibilists are more optimistic. Strictly speaking, a compatibilist doesn't have to say that we do have free will. A compatibilist simply holds that free will and the truth of determinism are compatible, that the truth of determinism does not imply that no one has free will, that no one's morally responsible. This is in some ways a puzzling position for a lot of people, although one of the things I want to suggest is it's not nearly as implausible as it might seem to you, even if you have some incompatibilist leanings to start out, and that frankly, at least some of the time, a lot of us do talk as if we're compatibilists. After all, we're very aware that our environment can have enormous impact on our kind of behavior and mental actions. We're aware that genetics have a kind of significant impact on who we are and the kind of people that we become, but nonetheless, we do hold people responsible, even though there's a lot of sense to be made that for a lot of folks, a lot of options simply aren't on the table. In any case, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the organizing thoughts behind compatibilism and where compatibilists might go. Now, if you recall, one of the arguments that incompatibilists and compatibilists both have to wrestle with is this argument that's reproduced on handout number 8. It was on handout number 7 as well, that suggests whether determinism or indeterminism is true, whether the other one's false, we don't have free will. Incompatibilists typically reject the second premise of that argument that says if indeterminism is true, then everything we do is random, everything is uncaused, and therefore we're not responsible for anything. Compatibilists are more likely to reject that first premise. Maybe they'll reject the second premise as well, but they're more likely to reject that first premise. They're going to deny that if determinism is true, we can never do other than what we do, and therefore we're not responsible. A compatibilist is going to say there's a perfectly reasonable sense in which even if everything that you do is determined, even if everything that comes before you do what you do is determined, it still might make sense to talk about you being responsible for what you do. Now, some of this will get illustrated a bit more when we get to Frankfurt and Frankfurt-style scenarios in the other video tutorial. But let's start by talking about different kinds of compatibilism to see where the compatibilist might go. The main distinction in the compatibilist literature that I'm interested in is the distinction between what I want to call hard compatibilism and a comparatively soft version of compatibilism. We call hard compatibilism hard because it takes a very hard line. According to hard compatibilism, freedom of the will is compatible with just any kind of determination, no matter what. There's no kind of determination per se that is incompatible with freedom. A philosopher who would go in for that kind of thesis would say that, look, even if everything that you did was determined, you might still desire to do the action that you want. There might be no beliefs that you have that there's anything wrong with what you're doing. You might wind up doing exactly what it is that you want to do. In that case, says the hard compatibilist, in what sense aren't you free? You're doing exactly what you want. You're getting exactly what you want. There's no obstacles. What's the problem? Now, just to be clear, hard compatibilism is not an especially popular doctrine, even among contemporary compatibilist philosophers. Very few philosophers really want to defend anything like hard compatibilism. And the main reason for this is that it seemed just obvious to a lot of philosophers that there's some kinds of determination, maybe not all kinds, but some kinds of determination that simply are incompatible with freedom and with moral responsibility. Suppose, for example, that the reason you want to do something, say rob a bank, is because you were hypnotized, because somebody kidnapped you and put a chip in your brain, a kind of Manchurian Candidate scenario, if that reference is still relevant. In that case, the guy who's under the influence of hypnosis or the brain chip or drugs or whatever is doing exactly what he wants, and he's getting exactly what he wants. But it seems so obvious to most of us that he's been manipulated in certain kinds of interesting ways that we think he just can't be free, that there's a very obvious sense in which he's under another person's control. So the typical hard compatibilist wants to say, again, no, not just any kind of determination is compatible with freedom. They're going to allow, as many of us do in a common sense moment, that some kinds of determination simply are incompatible with free will. But there still might be some kinds of determination that are compatible. A more plausible kind of compatibilism, then, is what we might call soft compatibilism. Soft compatibilism takes a comparatively soft line, not the hard line that says all kinds of determination are compatible with freedom, but the softer line that only some kinds of determination are compatible with freedom. So, for our example of a philosopher who goes in for soft compatibilism is the philosopher that, by the name of A.J. Ayer. Now, this piece from Ayer is from the first half of the 20th century. It's a little dated, but it is a nice statement of soft compatibilism. Ayer is going to agree with everybody else that if you are compelled, for example, or if you are coerced to do something, then you simply don't act freely, not in the ordinary sense of what we need by freedom. Okay? So if you suffer from a kind of compulsion, a kind of psychological compulsion, if I suffer from kleptomania, I can't help but steal. If I suffer from pyromania, an incredibly strong compulsive disorder that involves setting fires, Ayer would agree that kind of determination might be incompatible with freedom. And similarly, again, if you were compelled, or we might say if you're coerced to doing something, if someone holds a gun to your head, if you shove me and you fall into me through no fault of your own, then again, we might say you're not acting freely. But absent anything like coercion, and absent anything like a psychological compulsion, if it really is the case that you desire to perform some action, and you perform that action because of that desire, then, says the compatibilist, absent some kind of explanation, some compulsion, some case of coercion, your action is perfectly voluntary. It's your action, in which case we have every right to say that you're free. That said, it's perfectly possible, given that distinction between hard and soft compatibilism, that you were determined to desire things that you want to have, to want the things that you want. You had no choice in that. Our biology, our sociology, our upbringing, our genetics dictates an awful lot of that stuff. We're not really typically that free to want what we want and believe what we believe. Nonetheless, if these really are your desires, and absent anything like coercion or compulsion, the soft compatibilist says you're perfectly free. You're perfectly free. So this doctrine that Ayer is advocating is what we might call classical compatibilism. Classical compatibilism is a kind of soft compatibilism. That's the relationship. Okay? It's not a kind of hard compatibilism, it's a kind of soft compatibilism. And according to classical compatibilism, and again, philosophers like all the way from Hume to Ayer have advocated this kind of position, you are free. You act freely in any case. If you perform that action because of your desire, and you're free from anything like a compulsion or any kind of coercion.